Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining today's webinar. My name is Dr. Julio Friedman, a senior research scholar at the Center on Global Energy Policy and director of the Carbon Management Research Initiative. Today, we're going to discuss carbon capture and energy, with a special focus on local policy and development. This is the third in a series of events and panels being convened as part of the Women in Energy CCUS Roadshow. Today, we have a panel of extraordinary leaders to discuss the vital role of carbon capture and greenhouse gas emissions reduction technologies and in carbon dioxide removal, here focused on the state of Louisiana. Let me quickly say that this event is being webcast live, and the full video will be available online in the coming days. This event shares the findings of a report that is part of a collaboration on the field of CCUS and the Center on Global Energy Policy. For those of you who are joining us via Zoom, you can submit questions for the panelists at any time by clicking on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. We really do have an extraordinary lineup today, and we're starting with Sheila Hollis. We are joined by Sheila, who is the acting executive director of the United States Energy Association. After her comments, I will introduce first our fireside chat panelists, and then I will introduce our other panelists for the moderated discussion. Sheila, to you.
Thank you so much, Julio. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here. USEA is working closely with Julio and his people pursuant to DOE wanting us to do just that. Just to tell you what is the United States Energy Association for a moment, it's a nonpartisan, non-lobbying, and nonprofit organization. It's been around approximately 100 years. We worked in 104 countries throughout the world. We have a modest-sized staff, but we work very closely with the USAID, state, and energy. And we work very intensively in the United States to get the issues out there, have a forum in which the issues can be discussed, and basically to improve the energy scene throughout the world. We live in a world in which 30% of the people in the world have no energy whatsoever. So our efforts internationally have taken us to multiple parts of the world. We have done a huge project in Uganda. There's only 30%, as an example, only 30% of the people there have any form of electric power whatsoever. Put it in perspective. But we are delighted to work with the national labs on a continuing basis, cybersecurity and the like. Our board is made up of representatives of most major trade associations in the energy field, also consultants and other players, and in addition, educational institutions as well. Well, it was an honor to be asked to say a few words here. Because Louisiana is so near and dear to my heart personally, and also because it is such a very, very significant player, not just domestically, but internationally in the energy arena and the oil and gas arena in particular. I spent a lot of time in Louisiana and know it and love it intimately, and it's a beautiful place. And if the carbon capture project can be demonstrated in Louisiana, the opportunities to help the world, as wonderful as and as much as we want to help Louisiana and similarly situated states, although there's nothing that could possibly compare to the uniqueness of Louisiana, that would be so much help to the world. And if it could be done in Louisiana with the complexities and the lengthy history in the development of oil and gas, and come up with solutions that work in Louisiana, the future is so much more optimistic and wonderful for so many other parts of the world. It's a pleasure to join you today. I'll be staying on for the whole program. It's great to see a couple old friends here, including Senator Landrieu, my neighbor and longtime friend, and just a wonderful program filled with some of the best and brightest in the business. And delighted to be with you, Julio, Senator, and I will watch in awe and listen in awe of all the wonderful things that you're doing, and particularly what you're doing with respect to the potential on the horizon for reducing CO2, for improving the lives
Can people hear me? Hello?
I can hear you, but I believe that Sheila is frozen.
I can hear you. This is Mary.
Can the audience hear me? Can the panelists hear me? Yes, they can all hear us. Excellent.
Hear
Well,
you.
if you can hear me and see me, then we will continue. Apologies for the technical difficulties. Sheila, thank you very, very much for your comments. At this point, I would like to introduce the members of our fireside chat. Even though they need no introduction, it is only appropriate to do so. Let me start with Senator Mary Landrieu. Senator Landrieu served for many years as the junior and senior senator from the state of Louisiana. She has long, deep roots in the state, beginning her political career in Red Stick and Baton Rouge all the way back in 1996, serving first in the legislature and then the state treasurer, and then becoming the first woman elected to a full term in the US Senate for Louisiana. I think that Senator Landrieu is known as a centrist, somebody who is biased for action and who is good at getting things done. We also have the extraordinary good fortune to be joined by Representative Malinda White. She is a representative from District 75, representing St. Tammany and Washington parishes. She was elected first in 2015 and should be able to serve all the way through to 2024. In addition to serving in the legislature, Representative White is also a businesswoman owning White's Business Machines. And both of these extraordinary individuals have been active and accomplished in the field of CCUS, so we are extremely fortunate to have you here. Thank you both for joining us.
Thank you.
If I can start here, let me ask you, we've seen CCS out there for a long time, 20 years we've been watching and waiting. It seems like we're having a moment right now. It seems like things are changing. Let me ask each of you sort of what you're seeing happening at the federal level and what you're seeing happening at the state level that makes you think changes are afoot. Senator, can we start with you perhaps?
Thanks, Julio. I appreciate it. And I'm so glad to be on this panel with Representative White, who's been a real leader in our state on state policy, and she can fill in so many of those details that I, of course, try to keep up with, but can't keep up as well as she can as a member, currently a member of the legislature. But also, Julio, I want to just say quickly what a joy it's been to work with you, Dr. Friedman, and also Jason Bordoff, who runs the Global Center for Energy, and really what an amazing impact you all have had since Jason started that program probably about 5 or 6 years ago, is maybe longer, time goes by, but I see the
I'm sorry
impact.
to say it's been 8 years actually.
8 years, okay. But the impact that you all have had in just getting out really vital, nonpartisan, scientific, factual information about these sort of complicated energy transition issues, not just in America, but around the world. And that's why you're a global center. People understand the power of Columbia University, and to have all that brain power on this subject is really important. So thank you. And I have to give a shout out, of course, to Sheila, who I know, and thank her for her leadership. And then Marjorie McKithen, who has comes from a very distinguished Louisiana family and is a great lawyer and leader in this field with her firm. And I'm looking forward to sharing the panel with her. But let me jump right in and say, Julio, you're right. Carbon sequestration is not new to Louisiana, actually, or to the oil and gas world, but it seems to be somewhat new to the country and maybe to the world. This technology has actually been around for more than 50 years. The oil and gas industry has been using it for enhanced oil recovery. Now, Louisiana is one of only a few states that actually knows how to drill wells. And for the most part, we drill them well and without accident. We've had, of course, some horrific and, internationally known disasters. But for the most part, the 40,000 wells we've drilled in the Gulf of Mexico and the hundreds of thousands we've drilled on our own land, as well as Texas, this use of carbon dioxide has been used, or carbon has been used for enhanced oil recovery. What's changing in Washington and what's understanding is the benefit of the expansion of this technology in the industrial sector and in other sectors to decarbonize our planet. And it really is exciting. And there's a real opportunity, as was said by our first speaker, by Sheila, about Louisiana helping to lead this effort, because if we can, in the areas that have the experience, the geology, the skilled workforce, ample water, which is required for these processes, the skills of our engineers and technicians, if we can figure out how to do this on a large scale, we can not only help our state continue to be an energy leader, but an energy leader in the future, and create even more jobs than exist in our state today, but we can help the world. Just to put this in scale, and Julio, you can correct me because you are truly one of the world's experts on this subject. But as I was preparing for this panel, there are, I understand, 40 million tons of carbon being sequestered in the world through this process right now. But America alone produces 5 billion tons of carbon annually. So the gap between where we are and what we are sequestering or using or sequestering now, and what we have to do is massive. And this isn't going to be done with one little tiny step, at a time. In some ways, it's got to be. So to conclude this, the federal government just passed a major bipartisan infrastructure bill, which is really, truly an amazing accomplishment. And I want to give credit to Senator Bill Cassidy, took my seat in the Senate, but he was one of the ones that led this effort, and he really deserves a shout out because there were 10 senators that stepped up. And in this bill, there's the SCALE Act, which is included in this big bill, which allocates billions of dollars for investments, direct investments, tax credits, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And anybody can go online, look up the SCALE Act, get the details of it. But also, finally, Joe Manchin, who leads this committee, Energy Committee, I chaired it for a while and served on it for 18 years. His staff is actually from Louisiana. People might, that aren't from Louisiana are going to think, well, Louisiana people are taking over. Yes, we are. And so they are staffing him, and from St. Tammany Parish. I mean, interesting. And they understand this issue well. He understands it well. So we think we have a real champion in Washington, along with bipartisan, Republicans and Democrats. So I'll leave it at that and turn it, I have, Representative White add from Louisiana's perspective. But yes, there's lots of things happening, Julio, thanks to you and others that are working on it. And I think Congress is focused, and it's a great opportunity for our state.
So Representative White, building on that, first of all, yes, it is 40 million tons worldwide, and a lot of that is in the US. And almost all of that is in industry. Louisiana is proud of its heavy industry and what you provide to the world. And Senator Landrieu mentioned that. Do you want to talk a bit about, from the state's perspective, how you think about those assets and those resources and why the state's so active today?
Thank you. First of all, it is an honor to join Senator Landrieu. She's an icon and a hero to me. I've watched her for many, many years, and I am honored to be a part of this panel. So, Louisiana is poised for unprecedented development of carbon capture, utilization, and storage projects. As I passed this legislation along, I kept telling my colleagues that X marks the spot. We have many of the industrial carbon sources. We have the existing infrastructure of pipelines and established pipeline right-of-ways for carbon transport, and oil and gas operators with the knowledge and expertise, as the senator stated earlier, who can make these CCUS projects work. Nearly 60% of the CO2 emissions from Louisiana are from industrial facilities, and many of which provide high purity, low cost opportunities for capture and compression. The bulk of the CO2 emissions from other states and nations are also the electric power generation and transportation sector, where the cost of capture are higher. But you add to these advantages, Louisiana has legislative, regulatory, and administrative advantages over other states. We were early to adopt state legislation in 2009 focused on safely promoting CCUS. We enacted the Louisiana Geological Suppression of Carbon Dioxide Act, and that was the one that I amended and prepared us for where we are today. So Louisiana Commission of Conservation, the LDNR, Office of Conservation, has a regulatory authority over the underground injection of carbon, the ability to certify CCUS projects, for eminent domain authority and regulation of carbon pipelines. This really sped up our process some 13, 14 months. So we were able to get on the ground running very quickly with this. And as you've seen some of the announcements that we've had, with a $4.9 billion investment with one of our companies that already exists. Creating new jobs and cleaner environment is what really spurred my interest in this. I actually have a relative that was sent to Australia to set up a plant there with the carbon capture, and he grew up across the state line in Mississippi from me. So in layman terms and country boy terms, he stated that we pull the fossil fuels out of the ground, we capture the carbons and sequester, liquefy, and send them back to where they come from. Now that's in his process that he does with natural LNG. What I have discovered through this process is that it can be also used as a byproduct for energy. And this is something I think that will open up a lot of future transportation needs, and there we will be ready in Louisiana to roll this out as we already have. So there's so much more to this. I'm not the expert on the issue. However, I'm quickly learning a lot about the industry, and I'm proud to be a part of legacy work that will will be a pivotal point to energy in Louisiana and in the world.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very, very much. And of course, I agree with all of that. Louisiana has been a front leader for many, many years, and not just because of your work and Senator Landrieu's work, but Governor Edwards, people like Jason Lanclose, who have been on the beat, industrial leaders and community leaders as well. I wanted to take a minute and talk about the communities themselves. Many of these are going to be big projects in communities. People like to talk about the pluses in the communities. People like to talk about the minuses in the communities. I think that communities, though, are ultimately where these kinds of projects land, where they anchor. And because you guys work so closely with the communities in your state, I was hoping you might have a perspective on that.
Well, Malinda, if you don't mind, I'll jump in here and be brief. I just want to say, and a lot of this work right now, what's really helping to move Louisiana forward is the leadership of John Bel Edwards. I mean, I cannot overestimate how, overestimate, because he is from a traditional oil and gas state that has traditionally been resistive to change. He, is a Democratic governor in a red-leaning state or red state. But it's incredible how he's put together this sort of climate solutions panel and task force committed early, to net zero, really helping to push our industry, our transportation sector, our maritime sector, everyone, our large and small businesses to think about how to move, number one. So he gets a lot of credit for accelerating, Julio, what we've described as going on. But also, number two, the communities themselves, as you've asked, are familiar with the laying of pipelines and the siting of facilities. Now, there is sensitivity, of course, around this because not all of these facilities are like, putting in a beautiful, forest or garden. They're industrial by their very nature. We have an Air Products underway right now. Marjorie, I think, has been helping to lead that effort. We have Capio, which is an LLC working in the Port of Baton Rouge. But but these projects can be sited. These pipelines can be utilized. You know, there are 5,000 miles of pipeline that have already been laid that can carry these high pressures. We have hundreds of thousands of pipelines in the United States. So there's a small subset that's already pre-positioned, but we can build more. We know how to site more. But you have to work with the local communities to do this. Now, in the Gulf Coast, generally, not the East Coast, not the West Coast, but in the Gulf Coast and somewhat in the Midwest, in that industrial corridor, like Ohio and Chicago area, that area, people are used to laying this kind of infrastructure. But you have to be able to put this infrastructure down to be able to move this. You know, you've got to transport it either by pipeline or by rail. So while we can do it and the technology is there, we also have to find the political will to want to do this and to let people understand that, yes, we may lose, Malinda, some jobs, quote, in the traditional oil and gas, but just a pivot helps us maintain and grow those same kinds of jobs. It's not like going from industrial to retail where you made, you know, $90 an hour and now you're making 15. It's literally like you could make $50 to $90 an hour here, and you can still make that on this side. And that is what John Bell is trying hard to help our state understand. And so I'll turn it over to Representative White.
Senator, that this is all true. When I first began in the legislature and working with the governor very closely, I kept asking him, you know, when are we going to do this carbon capture? When are we going to do this? And, you know, we had to get out of a deficit, and he had tremendous amount of issues caused by climate change, flooding, unprecedented flooding, hurricanes and such. And then we had COVID. So it's been a delay, but at the same time, he's still been laying the tracks for it. And so when this piece of legislation came up, I was notified that this is it, and we're going to go for it, and picked up a lot of bipartisan help. But it's true, as the senator stated, people are very resistant to change. They're very nervous about the unknown. But I think as we've had more and more conversations about this on the global front, and as well as at the state and local levels, I think people are becoming more understanding that this is actually going to create better, newer jobs with less impact on the earth, less of a carbon footprint, and that is our goal. So we, as a state, really want to lead the country in this effort with all the resources that we already have in place. It's just a natural fit for us, and we're really excited to really make those steps, and so appreciative to have a governor that completely understands this, and one that has just enough complete military in him to make sure that steps are taken and actions are taken. And that's what I have the most respect for in government. It's very hard to see action. So when you find that, it is really exciting to me.
Terrific. Thank you very much, both. Last question here before we have to pivot to the panelists. I know that part of the reason Louisiana is a state, and part of the reason the Biden administration and Congress is leading on this issue with CCS is about international competitiveness. The fact that we see other countries around the world also pursuing a net zero agenda, that we see a competition among places developing CCS projects around the world, that we see a drive, for example, through the First Actors Coalition for low carbon products, whether they are steel or methanol or fuels or chemicals or plastics. How do you guys see CCS as a technology in the context of this international competition and in the context of America's competitiveness and Louisiana's competitiveness?
Well, Julio, let me say this. It is essential to be a part, a big part, a significant part of this transition. And without it, we won't make our goals, period. Secondly, hydrogen has to be a big part of this because, yes, we can make all of our vehicles electric. We're on the path to do that. Some people don't think so, but we're generally, the federal government is sort of taking the steps, being led by states like California, et cetera, and the car manufacturers now are moving. We know how to transform our utility grid. It's just a matter of public will to do it. But when you're talking about the industrial carbon, our industrial base, which is our manufacturing base, which we've already lost a good bit to China, we want to save what's left and grow it. You cannot do this without carbon sequestration and hydrogen. And in Washington, I'm sorry to say, there are some from my party and maybe independents, I don't know, maybe even a few Republicans, I don't know, I'll just say there are some on both sides that basically want to shut down every oil and gas well and every industrial and just put everybody on solar and wind. It's not going to work. It's not going to work for the developed world. It's not going to work for the developing world. As you could see what the nations of Africa said, you want to shut down oil and gas wells, is what they said in Scotland. You all go first. And then once you all go, we'll follow you. Because Africa understands it needs the capacity of industrial heat and strength. You can't get that from wind and solar. That's not to say that wind and solar aren't doing great work, and we're expanding solar in Louisiana. We're doing offshore wind. We're doing it all. But I'll end with this. Joe Manchin is right when he says this is not a process of elimination. This is a process of innovation. And let our scientists and engineers lead the way. And that is what I think John Bell Edwards believes. That is what Malinda believes. That is what a growing group of political leadership in Louisiana believes. And we think we can lead not only ourselves, but other states. So I'll just leave it at that, because we have to do this for ourselves. But by doing it for ourselves, we can help the world figure out and compete with China and not give up our manufacturing power. Why would we do that? Why would we let all of it go to China or India? Let's keep it in the US, and this is the way you keep it. So thank you, Julio, for putting the science out there that helps us to follow the science. And then it's just a matter of building political will around it, which is not always easy. I'll leave it at that.
Indeed, not always easy. Thank you very much, Senator. Senator White, what would you like, Representative White, what would you like to add to that? Or how do you see, again, sort of the state's perspective working through all this?
Senator Landry really summed it up very well, and Louisiana being a big player and a part of the big picture. And it is going to be something that we all have to work together on in order to reach the zero emissions. So I'm really excited about being a part of that, and watching Louisiana for the first time really be first and leaders in this particular avenue. We're moving forward with it, and we're excited to be part of that. As far as the competition, like the senator said, the faster we move on this, the better off we'll all be, and competing with China and keeping our industry here. And it is a balancing act that we have to figure out. There are people that oppose, they want to shut everything down. However, we like the services, we like the things that it creates for us. And so what we're going to do is find a better way to produce that, and using the byproducts of it, which is so interesting to me. I grew up in a very rural parish, and you use everything and every part of what is available to you. And this is the same, even at this level, it's the same. And as far as using the products that we have and the byproducts to have a cleaner energy across the board. So I'm really not sure if that really answers your question on competition, but I do know that whoever's first at the table and is processing and is delivering will definitely have an advantage. And we're feeling really good about that in Louisiana. We want to promote that and make sure that we're the leaders.
And Julio, one example is, I represent Venture Global, which is one of the largest exporters of natural gas in the world. And so they're taking natural gas from many places and exporting it. And they are in the process of doing a very aggressive carbon sequestration. And they're in the place, in Cameron and in Plaquemine. Eventually, they're building in Plaquemine, already pretty up and not quite running, but up and structured in Cameron. And so our companies are, and that's just one, but there are dozens probably of other companies that are doing the same thing now, because their investors and the capital markets are actually going to be putting pressure on companies like this. Will you, sequestering your carbon, or your low carbon producer? What are you doing? And so our industrial sector can lead. That's all I'm saying. And we are, hopefully. So again, thank you for the opportunity. And, for companies like Venture Global and others that are, moving out ahead. And of course, I mentioned others as well. And Marjorie knows some of the others that are operating in our state. And we have sister, projects in Texas. So our region is really kind of leaning forward and excited and able to do it. We just need the right policies, like for Malinda to do this at the state level, and for this bipartisan bill to pass, and for Joe Biden to continue to lay this foundation out for our country is just, incredibly important. And the president, say, not just Joe Manchin, but Joe Biden as well, or I'll get in trouble. All right.
Yeah, you did say Joe Biden, but the
Joe
president,
Manchin and Joe Biden and others.
Right. Well, thank you both. I would love to continue this conversation for another hour, but we actually have another set of extraordinary people here we're about to introduce. Nonetheless, thank you both so much for joining us. I know that you have to leave in a little bit. We're hoping you can come back later to help with the questions and answers. I would like to remind everybody who is on the call that we are collecting your questions. Thank you for sending them in. Please use the Q&A function on your Zoom link, and then that will allow us to take your questions and address them later in the Q&A session. Before that, though, I'm pleased that we are now joined by two extraordinary panelists. Again, big and active in the state of Louisiana, and glad for it. Let me start by introducing first Dr. Brittany Tarufelli. Dr. Tarufelli is an energy research economist, getting her doctorate from the University of Wyoming, master's in business economics from the University of Amsterdam, and the BS in financial analysis from Louisiana State University. Until very recently, she was faculty at Louisiana State University and is now joined Pacific Northwest National Labs and is actually calling us today from a remote location. Brittany, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Tarufelli. Before I turn to either of you for comments, let me also introduce our other panelist, Marjorie McKeithen. Marjorie McKeithen co-chairs the Jones and Walker Energy, Environment, and Natural Resources Industry team. She is the former Secretary of the Louisiana Mineral and Energy Board and Assistant Secretary of Louisiana's Department of Resources, Office of Mineral Resources. And while she was there, she oversaw the granting and administering of mineral leases, storage agreements, and alternative energy agreements on state-owned lands and water bottoms. She regularly serves as project counsel for large-scale energy and environmental infrastructure projects, including carbon capture and sequestration projects, hydrogen facilities, and others. Both of your resumes are so long I'd eat up the whole hour just singing your praises. But Marjorie, we're glad to have you here with Dr. Tarufelli. I'd like to ask each of you to just make a couple of minutes of opening comments. Dr. Tarufelli, let's start with you. From your perspective, how do you think about CCS? How do you see it evolving nationally? How do you think about it in the state of Louisiana?
Okay, thank you. So as Dr. Friedman mentioned, I'm currently an energy economist with Pacific Northwest National Laboratory, but for a few years I worked as an assistant professor at Louisiana State University Center for Energy Studies. So my research tends to focus on the ongoing transition to clean energy, relationships between public policy, energy markets, and the environment. And carbon capture and sequestration is a piece of that puzzle, and very important for Louisiana. So I wanted to thank Dr. Friedman and the Columbia Center for hosting this event and facilitating this discussion, because carbon capture is a crucial part of our nation's energy future. and I'm glad to be a part of this event. So to talk about carbon capture a little bit more specifically, I've done a few papers on some specific research aspects of carbon capture. So in one paper, we basically estimate the costs of carbon capture, transport, and storage for several facilities in the US. And the idea with that was to see how feasible is carbon capture at the current 45Q tax levels. So the idea with this paper was to just say, with the existing incentives that we have, how feasible is carbon capture at the national level? And basically what we found was that it is feasible for some facilities. So as Representative White was mentioning, some of these facilities that have really pure exhaust streams of CO2 emissions, that makes capture a little bit cheaper. But another important finding from this paper was that we can capture a lot more emissions if facilities share infrastructure. So if facilities share carbon transport and storage infrastructure, that will bring down the costs a lot. And so I think this is really relevant for Louisiana, because Louisiana has everything you need to make a carbon capture hub. They have a really dense industrial corridor. They have existing infrastructure. They have transportation and storage infrastructure, and they also have the technical know-how. So just to kind of briefly summarize from this paper, which you can find in Energy Policy, at the national level, I think that there is much more appetite for carbon capture. I think it's a hot topic and it's a necessary topic. It's necessary for some industries where it's hard to abate emissions. We have to have carbon capture. However, it still remains expensive. So we need policy levers to bring down those costs. The 45Q tax credit is a step in the right direction. And also with the SCALE Act, with support to bring down the cost of transportation and storage infrastructure, I think that these are really good steps to help deploy carbon capture at scale.
Marvelous. Thank you so much. A lot to unpack there. And I look forward to unpacking it in a minute. First, though, I'm going to turn to Marjorie and get her perspectives. Again, sort of how do we think about CCS in a national context? How do we think about it in the state of Louisiana? And what's your view coming from the legal profession?
Thank you, Dr. Friedman. First of all, thank you for hosting us again. And I think you said it well earlier when you said that it appears that we've reached a moment. I want to thank Senator Landrieu and Representative White for their roles in helping us reach this moment. But Louisiana has been preparing for this legally, regulatory wise, and experience wise. First of all, from a legal perspective, we've been preparing for it for over a decade, having enacted our first carbon sequestration storage laws actually in 2008, when we changed the law to allow the Louisiana Mineral and Energy Board to grant agreements for the storage or sequestration of carbon dioxide on state land and water bottoms, and changing our basic law for underground reservoir storage to allow carbon dioxide storage back in 2008. Our more comprehensive Geologic Sequestration Act was passed in 2009 and then amended this past legislative session by Representative White. But Louisiana has been utilizing reservoirs for underground hydrocarbon storage for over half a century, and been doing it without environmental incident. So our geology is perfect for geologic sequestration. Our regulators are experienced in it. And our first laws for underground storage and reservoirs were actually enacted in 1962, believe it or not, before I was born. And we have been actively storing hydrocarbons in reservoirs since the 1960s, and regulating it. Our laws for carbon sequestration are very similar. But the actual regulations for Class 6 carbon sequestration wells are much more rigorous And as you know, Louisiana has sought primacy for administration of the Class 6 well program from the EPA, and is hopeful and expects to achieve primacy the first part of next year, which would put us third in the country behind Wyoming and South Dakota, I believe. So the only three to hopefully, if we achieve that goal, to achieve it next year as number 3. We had been hopeful that we would have reached this moment in Louisiana's history sooner and possibly used these statutes sooner than now, but we are here and we're ready for it. Our Louisiana Department of Natural Resources Secretary, Tom Harris, has been touting Louisiana's geology, statutory and regulatory scheme for sequestration for years. As Senator Landrieu pointed out, our Governor, John Bell Edwards, has included it as part of his comprehensive plan for having Louisiana become net zero on carbon by 2050. And it's a necessary component. As Senator Landrieu said, we can't just shut down everything. We need to transition. So this is allowing us to transition while inviting and establishing wonderful new green energy facilities and clean energy facilities, and such as the Air Products facility. Louisiana's Mineral and Energy Board just granted the first 2 carbon sequestration agreements and actually utilized that 2008 law this in the past couple of months, granting 2 large-scale carbon sequestration agreements on state lands to enable Air Products to come in with a clean blue hydrogen facility, $4.5 billion clean investment in Louisiana, and Capio sequestration, which will support a green fuels project, $9.2 billion facility in the Baton Rouge area. It is a dream come true for me to be associated with those on the legal side and to see more of these come to fruition. I'm excited for our state and excited about our leadership in this very important arena, and look forward to see them be developed and the sequestration utilized.
Superb. Thank you very much. There's a whole bunch of questions which I want to ask both of you. Thankfully, some of those questions are already asked by our audience. So I'm going to start with a layup, an easy one. Talk about Class 6 permitting and the request for primacy. What is it, and when does Louisiana expect to obtain Class 6 primacy?
So I'll take this one, Brittany, because there'll be
Please
a lot
do.
that won't be in my wheelhouse. But Louisiana, the current Class 6 well program, and what the Class 6 program is, and it sounds like whoever asked the question knows exactly what it is, but essentially, carbon sequestration is sort of the reverse of oil and gas exploration. You're actually drilling a well to inject the carbon dioxide deep beneath the surface and permanently keep it there. And the well that is utilized and authorized for that process is currently regulated by the Environmental Protection Agency. It is called a Class 6 injection well, and the EPA has very stringent regulations and laws and a regulatory process in place to regulate the applications and granting of applications for allowing one of those wells to be drilled and utilized. But states can request what is called primacy, which means the state would be granted after a rigorous review process to make sure that the state would administer the program and have regulations in place that are at least as onerous as the EPA regulations and process. A state can be granted what is called primacy, which is permission to administer that program on behalf of the EPA. And Louisiana has filed an application for primacy and has published draft regulations and is going through that process and expects to have primacy granted by the EPA by the first part of next year.
Excellent. Thank you very much. This one is kind of for both of you as well, although I think Dr. Tarafelli is probably best configured to ask this. A lot of people talk about the fact that renewable electricity is cost competitive today and therefore should take a larger portion of the grid. That is, in fact, one of the questions that's come in. And similarly, you mentioned 45Q, and we know that the Build Back Better plan has provisions to expand and increase 45Q. If you could take a minute and talk about the difference between the cost and the price of these things, their financeability, and the kind of role that they play in different sectors.
Sure. So just to kind of keep this conversation focused on carbon capture, I would think of there's a couple of things to think about. So one is with these industries that we're talking about in Louisiana, how much of their processes are electrified? Because if there is a larger and larger share of renewable electricity, that brings down the carbon footprint, if you will, or the carbon emissions for those processes that can be electrified. However, some of these industrial processes create emissions just by their very nature. So you can't really abate those with electricity. So that's one issue of why carbon capture is so important for Louisiana, is that even if we were to make the grid net zero, let's say, for example, there are some of these processes and these industrial facilities that we still would have emissions just by the very nature of their process, or if they need like a really high heat, which you can't get from electricity. So that's one issue with Louisiana. The other issue with carbon capture is we can think about using carbon capture on natural gas plants or other fossil fuel fired plants. And currently where we are with the grid as we approach, as we try to get to a net zero grid, is renewables bring more intermittency to the grid, because wind or solar just, sometimes the sun shines and sometimes the wind blows. And you have to be able to balance that with a generator that you can turn on. And so until we have enough storage, we need to think about how we meet those supply and demand imbalances, and we have to use a plant we can turn on. So typically right now it's mostly natural gas, still some coal in some places. And so those carbon capture plants, it's more expensive for a natural gas or a coal plant because just the nature of their emissions stream. So we also need to think about if we need those coal and gas plants. If we need those gas plants, especially, how do we make that carbon capture plant affordable? We still need the reliability, but how do we afford it when we're in this renewables world where prices are coming down? So those are kind of two issues in my mind that I think about with respect to renewable electricity.
Right. And it is, of course, the case that currently we have all kinds of policies that support renewable energy, and dare I say correctly so. The investment tax credit, the production tax credit, renewable portfolio standards, and all these other sorts of things. When we think about, taking a step back, today, for those in the audience who might not know, the current amended statute for 45Q is set at a $50 non-refundable tax credit for saline aquifer storage. Proposal in the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act is to raise that to $85 and fully refundable, a direct pay option, which would in fact be a substantial incentive and comparable to the other renewable incentives. This comes back to sort of a question of what are the roles of these technologies and how do they serve different sectors and how do they serve different needs. I think that it's fair to say that we believe that we are going to need lots of different kinds of energy, that we're going to need lots of different kinds of energy services. So again, thinking about this not just from a cost perspective, but from a financing perspective, what changes do you think have happened, whether it's infrastructure or legislation or incentives or public opinion, that make it easier to finance these projects? Maybe Marjorie, to you on that one.
Well, I think and look, I'm going to get a little bit out of my wheelhouse on some of this. So Brittany, please step in on adding to this. But I think what you were seeing with some of the newer projects is the new industry investment is that they're able to capture more with new more efficient technology, whereas with retrofitting an existing facility, you may only get 50 to 60% of the emissions. With new facilities, better technology, you can capture as much as 95% or more. And so that, I think, the new industry investment coupled with the market for those products, the cleaner products, and the 45Q all help to get there. Certainly a higher 45Q credit would help, particularly with retrofitting or capturing emissions from existing facilities that we can't afford to just shutter at the moment. And so I will, please, Brittany, turn to you to talk more about that. But that's why, unless you're doing a new investment, the current 45Q by itself, I don't think will get you there. Will get industry there for it to be economic to do this. So companies are just having to make the decision that they are going to do this, even if it's not economic for existing facilities. But a higher credit would certainly help to get more emissions out of the air and in the ground.
Yeah, specifically for things like fertilizer plants or ethylene crackers or these kinds of things. Dr. Tarafeli, your thoughts?
Sure. So just from a cost perspective with carbon capture, I think of three costs. The cost of capture, which is, as Marjorie was talking about, you have to think about, is it a new build or is it a retrofit? And then you have the cost of transport and the cost of storage. And all three of those costs add up and need to be covered by that 45Q tax credit or other incentives in order to make this economically feasible. So that cost of capture is going to really vary depending on the type of plant. So some things like natural gas processing might be pretty affordable, whereas a coal plant, for example, is going to be a lot more. And that's just the nature of how they have to capture the emissions with the carbon capture. And then you can also think about the transport and storage infrastructure. So if the infrastructure is already there, if there's already a pipeline, if there's already a storage facility that's been characterized, that makes these costs a lot more affordable for plants. So this is kind of getting into the increasing the 45Q and also the SCALE Act with some different incentives to kind of help finance the cost of this transportation and storage infrastructure. So from an investor's perspective, there's still, I think, a lot of risk in carbon capture. The industry where it is, a lot of these projects are kind of like first of its kind. There are some, more technical risks. There's a 12-year sunset provision on the 45Q. So there are things in place that make it a little bit risky for investors. And so you need support like low-cost loans or grant programs to help make this more to lower the risk for investors, essentially, is how I would think about it. And that's why it's kind of necessary at this point in time to have these incentives for carbon capture.
Right. And hopefully over time, not only the incentives for carbon capture, but for all clean energy technologies could be reduced as they enter the market and as costs drop. I want the audience to know that we have received a lot of questions about environmental impacts, about environmental justice and community. I'm holding off on those questions just a little bit because I'm hoping that Representative White or Senator Landrieu might be able to rejoin us in a little bit. We are going to be opening up the Q&A in about 10 minutes, and I plan to take those questions then. Perhaps we could talk, though, about a somewhat different question here, which is, again, about sort of these things in a national portfolio. We have not just sort of, as you said, one kind of thing. There are multiple issues around carbon capture and utilization and storage and the industries they serve. These include labor, the interests of organized labor, living wages, all those kinds of things. They touch not just on climate issues, but also on issues of environmental performance, pollution, and other real issues on people's minds. They talk about trade and competitiveness. I would ask your perspective on some of these sort of additional issues, not just the climate or just the cost issues, but how CCS can provide services or has questions or concerns that need to be addressed in these contexts.
Okay, I can start with this, Marjorie, unless you want to. Either way is fine. Okay, so from the perspective of employment, I think that Louisiana in particular could really benefit from carbon capture. So one way to think about this is that if we don't use carbon capture and we implement some sort of price on carbon and we need to bring down our emissions, then without carbon capture, we basically need to cut consumption. So we basically need to stop producing as much goods or products from these emissions intensive firms, which would cause job loss. So one thing carbon capture does is it kind of enables us to have a smoother transition to a net zero world, because we can keep producing these goods, but in a lower emissions way. The other thing is with retrofitting these plants, with building new plants, with getting this infrastructure in place, that creates jobs. And these jobs are the kind of jobs that Senator Landrieu says that are already in Louisiana. So the workforce is skilled and able to take on these kinds of jobs. So I think that can be a real benefit. Now to get into more of what I think of an environmental justice perspective, carbon capture is also going to reduce this pollution in the air. So we have this concentrated industrial corridor, and that does create a lot of pollution, especially for these communities that are located in this industrial corridor and these people that work at these plants. So carbon capture is going to scrub out the carbon, but it's also going to capture some of these other local pollutants. And so that can create some environmental
can you expand on that
benefits.
just a minute? I think a lot of people miss this point, and it's something that's near and dear to my heart. Why is it that if you retrofit a facility, it reduces pollution loads as well as carbon loads?
So, I mean, and you're the expert on this probably more so than me, but when you scrub, as I understand it, when you scrub to remove the pollution, you're not only going to remove carbon dioxide, you're also going to get things like your sulfur, your SO2, your sulfur dioxide, or your nitrogen oxide, particulate matter. So it's going to clean out other pollutants. And these pollutants are considered local. So where they occur is where they're going to cause damage. And you can think of it in terms of health damage, respiratory damage, things like that. And so carbon capture can help reduce those local pollutants, which are, this can really create a good environmental and health benefit for these communities. And, increase our energy equity, energy justice. So when we're transitioning to this clean energy system, we also want to think about how can communities benefit? How can we make this a more equitable future? And this is one way in which carbon capture can help.
Marjorie, your thoughts?
Yeah, I would just add to that from a legal and regulatory perspective, environmental justice considerations will be a part of every permit application analysis. And I think Brittany said it well, that using carbon capture and sequestration in for current emissions that may be in the industrial corridor, which may be in some of communities that historically may have been more impacted, you'll be taking those emissions, sequestering them in a more remote location generally. So if anything, carbon capture and sequestration can help reduce the impacts on historically more impacted communities.
Excellent. This is perhaps a good time to open up to the wider question and answer session. In that context, I see that Sheila Hollis has raised her hand and may have something to add to this particular question as well. And then we will, Representative White and Senator Landrieu, if you're around, you're certainly welcome to join us. Again, we're talking about questions of local impacts and environmental justice. Sheila, first to you. I think you've heard Brittany and Marjorie's comments. What is your perspective on this?
Well, in my other life, I'm on the board of governors for the American Bar Association, representing the section of Environment and Energy Resources. And that section put forward with a couple of other sections for the environmental justice issue to be embraced as an issue, which the ABA now has as one of its major policy initiatives. So that's the largest legal organization in the country. And that's probably 150,000 lawyers, and they're very active, obviously, in every state. So I think that's an important indicia of the fact that this is an issue that is not going to go away, that it's going to be in the public eye and going to be a major topic of discussion for some time to come.
So I can't say that I've ever visualized 150,000 lawyers in my life before.
It's scary, actually. But they breed like
Very
rats. you know?
scary, unless they're all like Marjorie, and Sheila, then would be okay, but otherwise.
Pretty rough out there.
Right. I've learned, by the way, to make a distinction between lawyers and my lawyers, which is an important distinction to make. Senator Landrieu, I'm sure you have thoughts on this issue as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm so glad that Sheila talked about the position that the ABA is taking. But this issue of environmental justice and community justice is a real high priority with this current administration in Washington, and they are pushing this commitment and this policy deeply and reliably through the agency rulemaking across the board at the federal level. There are also, in addition to that, states that have been taking the lead. Some states are lagging, but some states, some counties are moving forward. So it is going to be part of any permitting process. But just like Brittany was explaining, and I think you, Julio, the great thing about carbon capture is not only does it help us get rid of the carbon, it will reduce our pollution right in the same areas that really need the help in reducing the current air pollution and other toxic matters that have been in the air because of the Industrial Revolution. I mean, we just have to realize the last 100 years when we created, well, we didn't create it, we were a big part of it, a leader. I just got back from Scotland and was reminded that Scotland, who had the original coal, and England helped to create it as well. But we've done 130 years of doing a good job of sort of polluting the planet. Now we really have to figure out the technology to get that pollution and carbon under control. But these communities can be greatly benefited. So I'm really looking forward to talking more with Marjorie and our regulators in Louisiana and our parishes, like, particularly Assumption, St. John, St. James. This is our corridor, basically between Baton Rouge and New Orleans. Now, it's not the only place that we have issues, but that's our industrial corridor. Obviously New Orleans, people know that, but it's most outside of New Orleans. And then Texas has around Houston, et cetera, Galveston, blah. But it's exciting to think we could also clean up, and help some of these communities have better air, make sure the water's protected, that home values could go up, et cetera, et cetera. So I just ask people to not just have this reaction, oh, you're building something, it must be bad. You're building something, it's got to be bad. Let's think about how we move forward the next 100 years, building the right kinds of manufacturing, circular economy, taking recyclability to a whole different level, reducing our plastics and just, et cetera. And it could be terrific. And that's why, I love doing this work with all of you all, because it's a real exciting opportunity. But just like Malinda said, people are just resistant to change. But when they learn the facts and we can explain it in ways people can understand, I think we'll build more support for what we're trying to do.
Well, from your lips to God's ears, yes. Let me say that we've had a lot of questions coming in about this exact topic, and peer review, citations, and so forth. There is actually quite a good literature on this. I would first direct people to the Center on Environmental Quality at the White House. The White House earlier this year released a document on CCS, and they discussed the issues of pollution in it and provide citations there. Let me add that was supported not only by the director of Center for Environmental Quality, but also by the industrial lead, Dr. Jane Flegel, and Sarah Forbes, a detailee from the Department of Energy. It's worth mentioning because, again, carbon capture and storage is blessed with a superabundance of extraordinary and accomplished women in this field, which has helped what makes it so successful and so great. One of the questions that's come up, I'm going to have to sort of rephrase it a little bit. We're seeing policies coming up around the world. For example, we have the $170 carbon tax coming up in Canada. We have $200 carbon tax in Norway. The European trading scheme price is rising. We're seeing mandates in various countries for clean energy technology, for green hydrogen, blue hydrogen, for all kinds of stuff. And so there's two policy questions that have come forward. One of them is, whoops, sorry, the light's tricky where I am. One of them is, do you think that we're going to pass a carbon tax? Is that necessary to do in the United States to get this to market? And separately, do we think that Build Back Better is going to pass? What's the over under on the existing legislation?
Who wants
Oh,
to
nobody's
take
going
that?
to take that one.
I mean, I can start, I can talk about the carbon tax a little bit, but I don't think I can answer the question about if the Build Back Better Act would pass. I'm sure there are better people on this panel to answer that question. So I'm an economist, and I think, you know, a carbon tax would be the best, most efficient way to place a value on carbon. And the reason for that is if you place the value on carbon with the carbon tax, then it incentivizes companies to find the most affordable way to reduce their emissions. So they can think about a portfolio of options. Do I reduce demand? Do I use energy efficiency? Do I use more renewable power? Do I use carbon capture? Let's think about all of these options and figure out what's our most cost-effective way to get there. Absent a carbon tax, I think that for things like carbon capture, we need to reduce these emissions. We have to place a value on carbon. So the 45Q is a step in the right direction. The Scale Act is a step in the right direction. Is it the most cost-effective way to do this? No, I think that a carbon tax would be more cost-effective, but in the absence of that, I think, you know, placing a value on carbon is better than not. That would be my 2 cents on the carbon tax.
And Julio, I'll just follow up with that. I think Brittany's absolutely correct. There is growing support in both parties. Obviously, the Democratic Party is leaning more forward on this with some exceptions and some carve-outs, like no additional tax at the pump for gasoline prices that are already high, a carbon tax that's nowhere close to $170 a ton, but more like, you know, 20 or 30, which the economists and scientists amazingly have shared with us in a broad way, that even at that level there could be, which isn't that high, it's not nearly as high as what you just spoke about in other countries, would still move America pretty quickly. But what is extraordinary really that's happening in this field, I think, from the work that I'm doing, is that industry itself is now realizing this is the best way forward. You know, they were sort of sitting on the sidelines or opposing it. But it's not just the energy companies, the industrial companies. Now they have various forms of how you apply it and how you do it, and whether it's a dividend and what you do with the revenues that are raised. And, you know, it has to be with a border adjustment fee as well to make sure that we maintain our jobs here. But most everyone, at least in the industry writ large, from Microsoft to United Airlines to everyone in between, is really understanding this is the most, and it's actually a conservative way. It's sort of a market-driven approach as opposed to a regulatory approach, which a lot of people just reject. Not everyone, but a lot of people reject. But getting there, getting those votes necessary. There are just a few senators that we need to change their position. They're not quite there yet. But I think we're moving in that direction because it just makes sense. But like going back, people are afraid of change. They don't like the word tax, but the fee that is now the 45Q sort of sets a price on carbon, which is the first step. The Scale Act will take it up a little bit more. So we're almost there. And if we can get there, it'll give business certainty. And the market then can use the power of the market to move this in a way that I think people will be surprised at how many jobs can be created at home and not have people left out, which is what they're afraid of, which most people are afraid of.
Excellent. Go ahead, Sheila.
Senator Landrieu, is it your sense that the investment bankers domestically and internationally find this acceptable, or, you know, on the whole ESG program, you think that will be enough to get the job done as far as continuing to produce energy, sell energy, use energy, perhaps more judiciously than we have in the past, but still be able to do it? Do you really feel that the investment community, with all the pressure on ESGs and all, is in that place?
And you're asking, is the investment community pushing on the ESG issues?
Not just ESG, but would they be willing to accept a carbon tax?
A carbon tax.
Mhm.
I don't know. Well, it may, I'm not in that wheelhouse exactly, but I can say that there is a tremendous amount of pressure, which everybody can just read the newspaper, any newspaper, conservative or liberal, and understand that, yes, the big, holders of capital in this country, whether it's pension funds or whether it's hedge funds or whether it's, private wealth, are really pushing to, because they believe, not because they're doing it for charity, they believe it can make them money. That's why they're doing it. They think that's what customers want. They think that that's where the markets are going. It's not necessarily government mandating it. It's the private markets, the power of that working to push, these, sort of green strategies. But if the government doesn't do something like this, if the government, and I'm talking about national government, if they don't do something like this that gives a broad national sort of framework to operate, which is what you're going to have is 50 different states doing different things, and companies that are trying to operate across the United States and the globe, we're driving them kind of crazy because they can't, they're selling products in Europe, they're trying to sell products in China. There's sort of no rules of the road. And America should be setting those rules, not accepting rules that other people make. We should be leading, just like we set rules for World War II or whatever with our allies. I mean, but the politics of it is tough. But it shouldn't be, but it is. I don't know, I'm sorry just to say it, but we've got to get a few more senators, on the Democratic side and Republican side, working on that. But there are lots of people working on it, but it would help. And then with ESG issues, yeah, the pressure to make sure that corporate boards are more diverse and our actions are being more inclusive of a nation like ours that's so diverse, and it's important that it be that way, or it's helpful and great to be that way. And maybe not everybody agrees with that, but I think the majority of America agrees that it's a powerful asset for us to have people from all over the world that are helping to build our economy. And so, yes, is the short answer.
Right. We often forget that we are part of the world, and that Russia exists, and that China exists, and that Europe exists, and Singapore exists, and they all have different wishes and goals, and we can help set the pace and set the agenda while we also build a cleaner and more just world. I want to make sure that either Marjorie or Representative White has a comment to add that they have the chance to do so. Would either of you like to contribute to this part of the discussion?
I don't have anything to add to it on this part, Julio. Thank you.
No problem. Excellent. So Representative White, anything to add to this?
No, I think everything has been covered really well. And as far as the carbon capture, what it means to Louisiana, the resources that we have, and how we're moving forward, it is with resistance. But I will say that the industry was very supportive of getting my legislation passed. They were a big part of that. It was actually unusual to me that of the support that I did have, because one thought the other didn't support, and they all did in the end. We were able to get that support. So it's exciting times to see an evolution of our energy, which has been, like the senator said, I mean, we've been doing things the same way 100 years, very slowly evolving. But I believe that with this particular carbon capture and leaving less of a footprint initiative, will change the way that we do business in the world. And I would like to see the United States be the leader in that aspect of it. And so, and Louisiana to be first in that push. So, and coming from a very heavy laden industry state, I think that we should be leaders, as we do have a lot of expertise in this field.
Julio, I would add one thing to what Representative White just said and to the discussion about labor and jobs and sort of, the economic impacts of carbon sequestration and the technology in workforce. This is something that, underground storage and reservoirs, Louisiana knows something about. And we have the workforce for it. Instead of taking something out of the ground, we'd be putting something into the ground. And as I mentioned in my opening remarks, we have been doing underground hydrocarbon storage since the 1960s. And so I just noticed in the chat room that somebody had a comment about sort of exporting these technologies and the knowledge and training. And certainly we have a workforce that is ready, willing, and able to do that. We have, regulators that have been engaged in this for decades. And I'm just excited about the opportunities for Louisiana and Louisiana workers in this space, given our background in similar matters for decades.
Thank you. We've got about 10 minutes left here. There's two questions I want to get to from the audience questions, and then one question I want to ask you myself. So if I could ask you to be sort of brief in your next round of comments around this. One of the topics that has come up, of course, is the topic of hydrogen. There's a question that was asked about the footprint associated with blue hydrogen. I want to couch this not just in the context of Louisiana, but also in Glasgow. We just had COP26. There has been this methane pledges that many nations have made, including the United States. The industry is moving forward to try to reduce its upstream fugitive methane emissions dramatically. How do you see all these things coming together in terms of a truly net zero circumstance and making sure that a program like a blue hydrogen program is right for the state and right for the nation? Anybody want to take a crack at that one?
I can start. I'm not a blue.
Okay.
No, go ahead, Brittany. I'll do it really briefly. I'm going to have to leave and
go, Senator. Yes.
Yeah, I've got to leave in just a second. But so Brittany, go ahead. But also, yeah. And again, I'm not an expert on the chemical, actions of hydrogen and how, it works. And Julio, you can explain it better than almost anyone in the world that I know of. So you can do the explanation. But it's similarly so important for us, for the industrial sector, to be able to use blue or green hydrogen, because solar and wind cannot run our industrial corridor. It just cannot. There's not enough solar to do it. It's not powerful enough, even if we had it on every probably inch of ground. And wind can't do it because it's not strong enough. So you've got to have higher heat, and the scientists can explain that. But as a politician, I just kind of get the general gist of it. But we can lead in that as well. And so that's also something that we can lead in the industrial sector. California might lead on cars. They're leading on cars. California said you can't sell a car in California if it's not 100% electric in some years soon. I don't know, man. I think it was 2035. Yeah. 2035. Well, why can California do that? Because they have a lot of people that drive cars. And when they say we're only buying this number of cars, the market has to move. We in Louisiana can drive this industrial transition. That's how strong and powerful we are, if we just understood it and weren't afraid of it. And with Texas, we could really together do a lot to say, okay, this is how the industry itself can say this. This is how we want to do it. And everybody's going to have to kind of cooperate here, or you're not going to have any more plastic cups. You're not going to have any more ventilators in hospitals. You're not, so I mean, we should kind of get a little attitude about hydrogen and carbon capture. And that's my last comment. So I'm going to leave you all. Yep. Thanks a gazillion. And please, Julio, explain it to everybody the way you've explained it to me. Thanks.
Thank you, Senator. And again, Godspeed and good luck with everything you do. Okay. Thank you for being here. I'm going to take just a minute on the hydrogen piece, but there's a second piece that follows from it, which I also want to get to. We do know that it is possible to build and run a blue hydrogen plant with very, very low carbon footprints. We know because some of those are run today, for example, in Canada. There's a great deal of scholarship on this. I would point people to Resources for the Future, Bauer et al. That was published this year, the Pembina Institute in Canada. All of these have published a lot of research on that. Most recently, Niall McDowell's paper in Jewel magazine. So we certainly know that blue hydrogen can be done well. It is also the case, though, that it can only be low carbon if you have high capture rates and very low fugitive methane emissions rates. And that those are both design requirements necessary to get that done. However, even if you had a great blue hydrogen project, you would need to move the CO2 and store it. And one of the questions that came in is we will need to build some CO2 pipelines to get this job done. Marjorie, you've mentioned this. Senator Landry mentioned it. Representative White's mentioned it. And Sheila's mentioned it, in part from the jobs perspective, but there will, of course, be environmental impacts. There will be questions about the siting. How do we think this through in a way that makes sense, specifically for the state?
And I would just add to what you said with the new projects and new build, in Louisiana, the emissions will be exactly what you described for the new build, which is 95% plus capture of the carbon and sequestration. Pipeline routes for permitting purposes, for proximity purposes, are very carefully chosen so that the least environmentally intrusive, or the least environmentally affects, the one that has the least environmental effects is chosen in order to get to the sequestration site. So you won't have hundreds of miles of pipe for sequestration. The site will be much closer than that in order to minimize the amount of pipe that's needed.
Co-located as much as possible.
Co-located as much as possible, but also as close as possible, so that even with co-location, you don't have to do as many miles of pipe.
Right. The pipes are a cost, and people want to avoid those costs if possible, of course, and want to avoid the environmental impacts that come from them. We have just a couple of minutes. This is the question I wanted to ask. Ultimately, climate change is a collective problem. It requires collective action. That means it requires generosity. It means we have to figure out how to work together, build partnerships. We have to figure out how to listen carefully to each other's concerns and issues. How do we think about building that kind of generosity around carbon capture and storage projects? What are proactive steps that we might take? Go ahead, Sheila. Why don't you lead this?
I think the more you talk about it and the more you get people together and get honed down, what are the issues, the real issues that are outstanding, that need to be resolved, and how can we resolve them, as opposed to this grand discussion of it with the fears and hopes and dreams and the ambitions. If you can get it down to something that is comprehensible for a regular citizen to understand, and why it works for them and why it works for the world, it might help. Also, I think a lack of understanding about how much the world has changed. There's a lot of analysis of how, 100 years ago, we only had 1/10 as much emissions. Well, that's because we've gone from 1 billion people on the planet to almost 8 billion people on the planet.
Right.
So
also, 70% of people living on farms to 10% of people living on farms.
Right. And also concrete, buildings, everything that goes with a human being. They carry a lot of baggage in their needs.
Entirely. Others want to add to this? Marjorie, you look like you're ready to go.
Julio, I just wanted to add one thought. And I think a kind of a fear and misconception about carbon sequestration is that, in some of the questions we've had here, is that somehow this will be used for enhanced recovery or whatever. But these projects are permanent. These are permanent sequestration of carbon. We're not talking about enhanced recovery to propagate oil and gas exploration. These agreements that were entered with the state, for example, actually have a permanent component in there. And so just thought that was an important sort of fallacy or misconception that a number of people have, is this is somehow temporary. You're going to be putting carbon in and taking it out. That's not the case. It is permanent.
So let me just briefly on that. I think there's two issues. One is people, in fact, have missed the point that all of these new projects going forward are saline formation projects, that they are not associated with enhanced oil recovery. In part, that's because of the 45Q credit. And again, the expansion of that in the Build Back Better plan would in fact provide an even higher premium for saline formation storage over enhanced oil recovery, which would make more of that. There's a separate question though, which is people say that it is in fact, the CCS just is throwing a lifeline to the oil and gas industry, that it gives them sort of sort of business as usual future. Again, people can differ on that. I cannot think of anything that's a greater departure from business as usual than the oil and gas industry and energy and heavy industry themselves taking stewardship of their emissions responsibly and managing it. That seems like a pretty different circumstance. Again, reasonable people disagree about that. I've just been fortunate to have the opportunity to talk about it with you fine folks today. And with that, I'm going to have to wrap it up. I'm very, very grateful to everybody who joined us today, not just our extraordinary panelists, Sheila and Brittany, Marjorie, Representative White, and Senator Landrieu. We are so grateful to you. But again, thank you to the audience, not only for attending, but also for asking questions and joining in the discussion. I found it exciting and fruitful. As we mentioned at the beginning, the full video recording of this event will be available on the Center of Global Energy Policy's website in a few days. While there, I would encourage you to take a look at many of the reports that we've written, not just on carbon capture and storage or industrial heat, but also on questions associated with the evolution of the grid, carbon pricing, geopolitics, and others. For a full calendar of upcoming events, I would take a look again at the Center on Global Energy Policy online. We hope you enjoy the rest of your day, and we do look forward to seeing you soon. Thank you once again.
Thank you.